There is a particular kind of pressure that arrives not with noise but with clarity. Not the roar of something breaking apart, but the quiet insistence of something that has been asking you a question for weeks and has now decided it is done waiting for a convenient answer. You know this feeling. It lives in the chest, just beneath the sternum, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. It is the feeling of a decision that is not being made by you so much as being made in you. And all that remains is whether you will acknowledge it honestly or find one more reason to postpone what the deeper part of you already knows. That is the essential quality of April 23, 2026. And tonight, when the first quarter moon becomes exact at 10:31 p.m. Eastern Time, the quality intensifies in a way that will be difficult to explain to anyone who isn't paying attention to the sky. If you are here, you are paying attention. Your birth chart is the most precise map of your soul's purpose that exists. A personal reading built from your exact date, time, and place of birth decodes your sun, moon, and rising, reveals the karmic patterns quietly running beneath the surface of your life, and maps the major transits shaping your 2026 month by month. You receive a personal audio reading delivered straight to your inbox and a detailed written report you can return to again and again. Nothing about this is generic. It is your chart, read for you alone, delivered within 48 hours. The link is below. The week that brought you here has been one of the most concentrated astrological periods of the entire year. A solar eclipse in Aries seeded a new cycle at 27 degrees. A triple conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Mercury burned through the early degrees of that same fire sign. The Sun crossed into Taurus just 4 days ago, shifting the atmosphere from fire to earth, from urgency to endurance. And through all of it, the Moon has been building. From the dark of the new moon eclipse, it has been waxing, growing, gathering light, moving through the crescent toward this, the first quarter. The first moment of genuine reckoning in the new cycle. You have been in the accumulation phase. Tonight is the arrival of the question. Most people understand the full moon. It is loud. It is legible. Emotions run high. Culminations arrive. Things that were hidden come into the light. The full moon has a language that even people with no interest in astrology can feel. The first quarter moon is quieter, which means it is often underestimated. But underestimating the first quarter is a mistake that the sky will not let you make forever. The first quarter moon occurs when the moon has traveled 90 degrees from the sun. 90 degrees is the angle of the square, and the square is the aspect of productive tension in astrology, the angle that creates friction between two forces that are both real and both valid, and both unable to simply coexist without something being asked of you. The square does not destroy, it demands. It stands at the crossroads and says, you have been moving in a direction. Now something has arrived that requires you to choose how much you mean it. In a first quarter moon, the tension is specifically between what was seeded at the new moon and what the world is actually presenting as the reality you have to work with. The new moon plants. The first quarter tests, not punishes, tests, not destroys, confronts. It asks whether what you initiated has enough genuine intention behind it to survive the first real friction. Tonight's first quarter moon at 3 degrees of Leo, squaring the sun at 3 degrees of Taurus, is asking that question in the language of two very different kinds of knowing. Taurus knows through the body, through the senses, through the patient accumulation of what is real and present and tangible. Taurus is not interested in performances or projections or the version of the story that sounds better than it feels. Taurus wants to know what you actually have, what is in your hands right now, what is solid enough to stand on. Leo, where the moon is traveling tonight, knows through the heart, through the need to be seen, genuinely seen, not just observed, through the creative impulse that requires expression or it begins to corrode the interior. Leo is the sign of the authentic self daring to take up visible space. Leo believes in the performance, not as a mask, but as a genuine offering of self, as the willingness to step into the light and say, this is who I am, this is what I bring, this is what I feel. When the moon is in Leo squaring the sun in Taurus, the tension between what you know through sensation and what you know through the heart becomes unavoidable. The Taurus sun is asking you to be honest about what is real in your practical life. The Leo moon is asking you to be honest about what the heart actually wants. And these two forms of honesty do not always align without effort. Sometimes what is practically real in your life is not what the heart is calling for. Sometimes what the heart is calling for requires you to make changes in the practical reality that feel uncomfortable, risky, or uncertain. The first quarter moon at this specific polarity is the moment when those two truths face each other directly across a 90-degree angle, and one of them has to move. The solar eclipse 2 weeks ago planted a seed. What was seeded was the willingness to be a more authentic self, the version underneath the performance built for others' expectations. The first quarter moon tonight is the first real test of that seed. The world has reasserted itself in the days since the eclipse. The ordinary pressures have returned. The habits have tried to re-establish themselves. The people around you have expected the familiar version of you to show up again. And the moon tonight, in Leo, pulling on the strings of the heart, is asking, which version of you is actually showing up? The one the eclipse was pointing toward? Or the one that felt safer than the eclipse's direction? This is not a gentle question. It is not a gentle night. But it is a genuinely clarifying one, and clarification, even when it comes with pressure, is one of the more valuable things the sky can offer a life that is trying to move forward honestly. There is a second force in tonight's chart that deserves its own careful attention, and it is one of the more significant events in the astrological calendar of 2026. Venus, the planet of value, relationship, aesthetic sensibility, and the deep intelligence of what you love, is forming an exact conjunction with Uranus at 29 degrees of Taurus. And this conjunction is not simply another Venus-Uranus meeting. It is the final one that will occur in Taurus for roughly another 84 years. Let that settle for a moment. Uranus has been moving through Taurus since 2018. 7 years of the planet of disruption and liberation moving through the sign of stability and value and the Earth itself. 7 years of the financial systems being shaken. 7 years of people's relationship to what they own, what they earn, what they believe they deserve, being pressed against an insistence that the old structures no longer fit. If you think back across the last 7 years of your own life and notice where the ground has shifted in the territory of money, resources, self-worth, and what you truly value, you are feeling the arc of Uranus through Taurus in your personal experience. In 2 days, Uranus enters Gemini. It leaves Taurus behind, this time permanently. And tonight, Venus meets Uranus at the very last degree of Taurus before that departure. 29 degrees, the anaretic degree, the degree that carries the full urgency of a sign that is completing its work and knows it. 29 degrees is not a quiet place. It is the place of maximum intensity in the final hours before a transition. It is the degree of culmination, of last chances, of the thing that absolutely must be said before the door closes. What Venus and Uranus are asking together in this final meeting at 29 degrees of Taurus is a question about worth. Not the theoretical worth you aspire to or the worth others have told you you possess or don't possess. The actual worth you have been moving toward across 7 years of Uranus reshaping your relationship to value. What did you learn about what you truly value during the Uranus in Taurus period? What changed in your relationship to money and to beauty and to the things you allow yourself to want? What version of your values is more genuinely yours than the version you entered 2018 with? Venus at 29 degrees of Taurus is the ruler of the Sun's current sign, which means she has particular authority in tonight's chart. She is not a supporting character tonight. She is one of the central voices, and she is meeting Uranus with an energy of liberating conclusion, of the breakthrough that happens when 7 years of slow pressure finally reach their definitive edge. Something in the territory of what you love, what you value, or how you understand your own worth is reaching a point of resolution tonight that will not be available again in the same form. Not because the lesson disappears, but because the frequency of Uranus in Taurus completes and moves on, and what remains is the version of you that 7 years of its pressure has shaped. This conjunction intensifies the first quarter moon's demand considerably. The moon in Leo is already asking whether you are showing up as the heart-led self the eclipse was pointing toward. Venus conjunct Uranus at the final degree of Taurus is asking whether you are living in alignment with what you actually value, not what you were told to value, not what was safe to value, not what fit the expectations of the relationships and environments you inherited, but what 7 years of disruption and liberation have clarified is genuinely yours. These two energies, the lunar square and the Venus-Uranus conjunction, are not asking the same question, but they are asking it in the same direction. Both are pointing at the gap between the version of you that is being constructed for external consumption and the version that actually carries your values, your heart, your genuine capacity for being alive in your own life. Tonight is the night that gap becomes impossible to paper over with one more delay. The first quarter moon becomes exact while the moon is in Leo, but before it reaches that exactness, it has been completing its final hours in Cancer, where it has been since yesterday. The shift from Cancer to Leo occurs at 3:40 p.m. Eastern Time, several hours before the first quarter becomes exact. And this transition is itself worth understanding because the quality of the evening changes in a perceptible way when it happens. Cancer is the sign of interior emotional life, of feeling before speaking, of the private world that most people never see. The moon in Cancer over the last day and a half has been drawing the emotional energy inward, amplifying the sensitivity of the collective field, pressing on the places where people feel most vulnerable and most genuine. In Cancer, emotions are real, but they are often held rather than shown. The protective instinct of Cancer, the way the crab carries its home on its back, means that the Cancer moon often produces a deepening of emotional awareness that doesn't necessarily translate immediately into action or expression. When the moon enters Leo this afternoon, the quality shifts. Leo does not hold things inside indefinitely. Leo was made for expression. The raw, the gesture, the willingness to step forward and let what is felt be seen. When the Cancer moon's depth of feeling meets Leo's need to give that feeling a form, what you often get is the emotional revelation. The conversation that was being formed in the quiet of the Cancer hours finally finds its voice in Leo. The thing that was brewing in the interior reaches the point of being ready to become visible. Tonight, this transition becomes the primer for the first quarter's exactness. By the time the moon squares the sun at 10:31 p.m., the emotional material that has been accumulating since the eclipse will have moved from the private Cancer mode of feeling it to the Leo mode of deciding what to do with it. And decision is precisely what the first quarter moon requires. The Sabian symbol for 3 degrees of Leo, where the moon becomes exact in its first quarter phase, is an image of a mature woman who has found a hidden path through the woods. This is a symbol worth pausing over. Not a young woman taking an obvious path. A mature woman, which suggests someone who has already lived enough life to understand that the obvious paths do not always lead to the right places, who has found a hidden path, which suggests discovery of something not immediately visible to everyone, through the woods, which is the ancient symbolic territory of the unconscious, of the parts of experience that are tangled and unlit and require something more than daylight logic to navigate. The moon at this degree is telling you that what is required tonight is not the decision that is most visible, or most expected, or most easily explained. It is the decision. That comes from finding the path that is genuinely yours through the territory that doesn't have clear signposts. The mature woman does not stumble onto the hidden path by accident. She finds it because she is experienced enough to know where to look, and honest enough with herself to admit when the visible path is not the right one. That is the quality of discernment the first quarter moon is asking for tonight. Not the obvious answer, the right one. The Aries stellium that dominated the sky on April 21st has separated. Mercury has moved ahead. Saturn and Mars are no longer in exact conjunction. But the sky does not simply erase what it has recently held at such concentrated intensity, and both Saturn and Mars remain in Aries tonight, contributing a texture to the chart that the first quarter moon must work within. Saturn at 8 degrees of Aries is in its retrograde shadow. It entered that shadow just days ago, which means it is now moving through degrees it will revisit when it turns retrograde later in the year. The shadow period is not retrograde itself, but it carries a quality of pending review. The ground Saturn is walking across right now is ground it will walk again. The decisions being made in this period, the structural choices, the commitments entered or exited, the forms given or withheld from the things you are trying to build, all of these will be returned to. Not undone necessarily, but examined with the benefit of hindsight. Saturn in its shadow is asking you to build things tonight that you will be comfortable defending when you see them again from the other side of the retrograde. Mars at 9 degrees of Aries is still moving through the territory of the stellium's recent exactness, still carrying the drive and directness and willingness to act without waiting for perfect conditions that Aries Mars always carries. The difference between Mars now and Mars in the exact conjunction is that Mars has slightly more space. The conjunction with Saturn pressed Mars into the very specific discipline of making the drive accountable to structure. As that exact pressure releases, Mars regains some of its native Aries freedom, that particular freedom of the self that moves before it has fully mapped the territory. For the first quarter moon's purposes, the Mars and Saturn positions in Aries mean that the decision the night is asking for is not merely emotional or internal. It has a practical dimension. It has a structural consequence. The Leo moon can feel the truth of what needs to happen. The Taurus sun can know it practically. But Mars in Aries is the force that actually takes the step, and Saturn in Aries is the reminder that the step, once taken, will build something real. The decision tonight is not a thought experiment. It is a genuine directional choice, and the Mars-Saturn combination in Aries ensures that whatever is chosen will have consequences that outlast the night. Jupiter at 17 degrees of Cancer is a quiet but significant presence in this chart as well. It is in no major exact aspect to the main players tonight, but Jupiter in Cancer has been the emotional intelligence container for this entire period. Since Jupiter entered Cancer last year, it has been amplifying the sign's natural wisdom, the wisdom of the body that knows before the mind does, the wisdom of the emotional field that registers misalignment before the logical apparatus has assembled its argument. Jupiter in Cancer tonight is offering an expanded emotional perspective on the decision the moon is pressing toward. It is the gentle voice beneath the urgency that says, trust what the deeper knowing has already registered, even if you cannot yet fully articulate it. Pluto at 5 degrees of Aquarius, moving slowly through the first degrees of the sign of collective awakening and structural transformation, is making no sharp aspects tonight, but is the background hum beneath everything. Pluto in Aquarius is the long arc, the generational shift, the rewriting of what collective life means and what systems are actually serving the humans they claim to be for. Its presence in the chart is a reminder that the personal decisions being pressed tonight are not made in isolation from the larger world that is also in the middle of one of its most significant transformational periods. The individual and the collective are both in the process of making decisions they can no longer defer. Neptune at 2 degrees of Aries is another slow outer planet contributing its texture. Neptune dissolves. It softens the edges between what is real and what is imagined, between what is yours and what you have absorbed from the environment, between the self and the collective dream. With Neptune in Aries, there is a particular complexity around the Aries themes of identity and the assertion of self. The boundary of the self is being gently pressed and sometimes dissolved in a way that can be confusing. Tonight, with the Leo moon asking you to assert yourself clearly and make a real decision, Neptune's presence asks that you do the work of distinguishing between the intuitive knowing that is genuinely yours and the absorbed expectations or fears that belong to the environment you have been swimming in. Not every feeling you are having tonight originated in you, but the ones that did are worth trusting completely. Every first quarter moon brings a decision. Not every first quarter moon is this specific about what the decision is. Tonight's is unusually precise because the chart as a whole, the moon in Leo, the sun in Taurus, Venus conjunct Uranus at 29 Taurus, Mars and Saturn still in Aries, Jupiter expanding Cancer's emotional intelligence, is coordinated around a single essential question. And the question, stated plainly, is this: in the new cycle that began at the solar eclipse in Aries, are you choosing the version of your life that is built around what is genuinely yours, your actual values, your actual heart, your actual direction, or the version that is built around what has been expected of you? This sounds like a simple question. It is not a simple question, because the expected version of a life is not always experienced as constraint. Sometimes it is experienced as safety, as the known quantity, as the path that has been walked long enough to feel like the only path, or even the right path. The first quarter moon's particular gift and particular difficulty is that it creates conditions in which the two versions of the life become unusually visible at the same time. For just a window of hours, usually centered around the exact aspect, you can see both simultaneously with unusual clarity. And in that window, the choice between them becomes real in a way it often isn't in the ordinary texture of the days. Tonight that window opens around the first quarter exact at 10:31 p.m. and it extends through the early hours that follow. You may feel it before then, as the moon shifts into Leo at 3:40 this afternoon and begins building toward the square. You may feel it most intensely in the evening hours when the Leo moon is fully engaged with the Taurus sun's grounded truth-telling, and Venus and Uranus are completing their final conjunction in the late degrees of Taurus. The window is real, the clarity it offers is real. And what you do with that clarity, whether you use it to finally move in the direction your deeper knowing has been pointing, or whether you wait for a more comfortable moment that the sky has not promised to provide, is entirely yours to decide. The hidden path through the woods is there tonight. The mature woman who has lived enough to know where to look is in you. What the first quarter moon is asking is whether you will trust her. The first quarter moon and the Venus-Uranus conjunction in Taurus affect each sign differently depending on where Taurus, Leo, and Aries fall in your personal chart. What follows is what the sky is specifically asking of each sign tonight. For Aries, tonight's first quarter moon falls in your fifth house of creative expression, joy, and the life that is lived for its own sake rather than for productivity or approval. The eclipse in your sign seeded something about your authentic self. The moon in Leo tonight is asking whether you are allowing that self-genuine expression in the dimensions of your life that exist for pleasure and creativity. Venus and Uranus, completing their final Taurus conjunction in your second house, are asking what you truly value in a material sense, what you have decided you are worth, and whether the practical choices of your life reflect that assessment honestly. The decision tonight for Aries is about whether you are living as fully as the eclipse invited, or whether you have already begun to manage yourself back into a smaller version. For Taurus, the sun is in your first house of identity and self, and the moon is in Leo in your fourth house of home, emotional foundation, and private life. This is a square between who you are presenting in the world and what is actually happening in the interior. The Venus-Uranus conjunction is in your first house, which makes it personal in the most direct way possible. Something about your sense of who you are and how you move through the world reaches its definitive edge tonight. Uranus departing your sign in 2 days completes a 7-year period of identity disruption and liberation. What has emerged from that period as genuinely yours? Tonight you feel the answer not as a concept but as a certainty in the body. For Gemini, the first quarter moon falls in your third house, the house of communication, the immediate environment, and the mental world you inhabit. The Leo moon is asking you to be bolder in expressing what you actually think rather than what is comfortable to say. The sun in Taurus is in your 12th house, which means some of the honest truth the night is pressing on is private, not yet ready for full public expression, but very real in the interior. Uranus entering your sign in 2 days changes your relationship to communication, thought, and movement in ways that will be felt for years. Tonight you feel the electric edge of that arrival. For Cancer, the moon is in Leo in your second house of worth, money, and the material conditions of your life. The first quarter moon is asking whether what you have built in the practical dimension of your life reflects what you genuinely value or what you were taught to settle for. The sun in Taurus is in your 11th house of community, friends, and collective purpose. There is a tension tonight between the private material reality of your life and the broader vision of what your life is participating in. Jupiter in your first house amplifies your emotional intelligence around this question. Trust what the body knows. For Leo, the moon is in your first house and the first quarter becomes exact in your own sign. This is the most personally concentrated placement of tonight's lunar energy. The question being asked of Leo is the most direct version of the first quarter's theme. Who are you actually being right now? And does that person reflect the genuine heart or the managed performance? The sun in Taurus is in your 10th house of career and public life. The tension is between the private, authentic self, which the moon in your first house is amplifying, and the professional, public self, which the Taurus sun is pressing to be honest. Something about how you present yourself in the world's view may need to come into closer alignment with who you actually are. Tonight is when the gap between those two things becomes undeniable. For Virgo, the first quarter moon falls in your 12th house of the unconscious. What is hidden, what is processed in private, and what is being released without full conscious awareness. This is a powerful but quieter placement for Virgo tonight. The Leo moon in the 12th is pressing on the things you feel but have not yet spoken, the interior truths that exist before they have become fully visible even to yourself. The Taurus sun is in your 9th house of meaning, philosophy, and the larger framework through which you understand your life. What you believe at the deepest level about what your life is for is being pressed against what you feel at the most interior level is actually happening in it. This is not a night for Virgo to reach external conclusions. It is a night to let the inner knowing surface. For Libra, the moon is in Leo in your 11th house of community, friendship, and collective purpose. The first quarter is asking whether the social world you are inhabiting actually reflects your genuine values and authentic self. The Venus-Uranus conjunction in Taurus is in your 8th house of shared resources, depth, and the territory where lives become genuinely intertwined. Something about the way a significant relationship or shared financial situation is structured has been reaching the end of its Uranus in Taurus disruption phase. What has 7 years of Uranus in your 8th house revealed about what you actually need from the people with whom you are genuinely intertwined? Tonight that revelation reaches its most precise edge. For Scorpio, the moon is in Leo in your 10th house of career, public life, and the direction of your outward ambitions. The Leo moon in this house asks whether you are moving in the professional direction that genuinely reflects your heart, or the direction that reflects what seems strategically correct or what others expected from you. The Taurus sun is in your 7th house of partnership. The tension tonight is between professional direction and relationship reality. What your most significant partnership actually requires of you, and what your professional ambitions are asking, may be in genuine tension tonight, and the first quarter moon is not going to let you look away from that tension for one more week. For Sagittarius, the moon is in Leo in your 9th house, which is your natural territory, the house of philosophy, higher learning, travel, meaning, and the larger frameworks through which life makes sense. The Leo moon in your 9th house is asking whether the meaning you are living by is genuinely yours, or whether it has been borrowed from a tradition, an institution, or another person's framework that no longer fits the actual shape of who you are becoming. The Venus-Uranus conjunction in your 6th house is completing its work in the dimension of daily life, health, and routine. Something about how you structure your ordinary days has been moving toward liberation for 7 years. Tonight it reaches its final form. For Capricorn, the moon is in Leo in your 8th house of transformation, shared resources, and the terrain where two people's lives genuinely merge. The first quarter moon in this house asks some of the most challenging questions of any placement. What is the truth about the depth of intimacy and genuine sharing in your most significant relationships? Are you fully present in the territory of real vulnerability, or are you managing from behind a structure that keeps the depth at a comfortable distance? The Taurus sun is in your fifth house of creative expression and joy. There is a tension tonight between the demands of genuine depth in relationship and the calling of what brings you genuine pleasure. Saturn, your ruling planet, is in Aries, pressing on your fourth house of home and foundation. The structural questions of private life are still very much in play. For Aquarius, the moon is in Leo in your seventh house of partnership, direct relationship, and the significant other. The first quarter moon in the seventh is one of the most interpersonally focused placements possible. Tonight, the question being asked is about your most significant relationship. Is it one that allows you to be genuinely yourself? Not the self that has been comfortable for others to relate to, but the self that has been clarifying through the eclipse season and the Aries pressure of recent weeks. Venus and Uranus complete their final conjunction in your fourth house of home and emotional foundation. 7 years of Uranus disrupting your sense of home, family, and emotional security reach their definitive resolution point tonight. What does home actually mean to you now at the end of this 7-year arc? For Pisces, the moon is in Leo in your sixth house of daily life, health, work, and the ordinary rhythms through which you move through your days. The first quarter moon year asks whether the daily structure of your life is one that actually supports the version of you that is emerging. Not the version that was convenient for old circumstances, but the one the eclipse was pointing toward. Are your daily habits, your working conditions, your physical routines actually serving the life you are trying to build? The Venus-Uranus conjunction in your third house completes 7 years of Uranus disrupting your relationship to communication, learning, and the local environment. Something about how you speak, how you think, and how you navigate the immediate world has been fundamentally liberated. Tonight, that liberation finds its final form before Uranus moves on. The first quarter moon does not stay, no lunar phase does. By tomorrow, the moon will have moved further into Leo, the square with the sun will have passed, and the acute pressure of tonight's decision point will begin to ease. In the days that follow, the moon will continue to wax toward the full moon, which arrives in the second week of May, and the seeds of what was decided or avoided deciding tonight will begin to show their first growth or their first consequences. But here is what is worth understanding about a first quarter decision made in this specific chart. Venus and Uranus completing their final Taurus conjunction tonight means that what you clarify about your values and worth in this window is not a temporary resolution. It is the conclusion of something that has been resolving for 7 years. Whatever you understand about what you genuinely value and what you genuinely deserve as Uranus stands at the final degree of Taurus, that understanding becomes the foundation you carry forward into a very different kind of Uranarity in Gemini, which is faster, more mental, more communicative, and requires you to already know what you stand for in order to articulate it clearly in the years ahead. The Leo moon pressing for decision tonight is also connected directly to the eclipse in Aries. The eclipse planted the seed of a more authentic self. The first quarter moon is the first test of whether that seed is being tended. What happens in the next few days, the concrete choices made or not made, the conversations begun or avoided, the directions moved toward or retreated from, will either strengthen the eclipse seed or weaken it. This is not pressure for its own sake. It is the natural intelligence of a cycle that knows it needs real nourishment in its early stages in order to become what it is capable of becoming. The practical guidance for tonight is not elaborate. It does not require a ceremony or a ritual or a lengthy journaling session, though any of those things can be useful if they are genuine rather than performed. What the first quarter moon actually requires is one honest thing. One moment of choosing the authentic response over the convenient one. One conversation that has been postponed. One direction taken toward what you actually value rather than what is safer to claim to value. one small, genuine step in the direction the eclipse pointed. The sky does not require grandeur from you tonight. It requires truth. And truth, as the Taurus sun knows better than any other placement in the zodiac, is most convincing not when it is performed dramatically, but when it is simply, quietly, undeniably present. There is a teaching embedded in the first quarter moon that most people discover not by reading about it but by living through several cycles of paying attention to it. The teaching is this: the moment of clarity that the first quarter provides is not sustainable. It is a window, and the window closes. On the other side of the first quarter, the waxing moon moves toward gibbous, and the atmosphere shifts from the sharp clarity of a right angle into the more rounded, accumulative quality of the build toward full. The gibbous phase is a time of adjustment and refinement, of working with what the first quarter clarified, of the less dramatic but equally important work of putting decisions into motion. This means that the clarity available tonight, the unusual visibility of both the authentic self and the expected self, the sharp edge between what is genuinely yours and what has been constructed for others, will not remain this accessible indefinitely. It is not that it disappears. It is that it becomes less legible in the days ahead as life reasserts its ordinary complexity and the decisions made or avoided tonight begin producing their consequences rather than presenting themselves as open choices. Tonight the choice is clearly visible. Tomorrow it begins to carry consequence. That is the nature of the first quarter, and it is why this phase is often the most demanding in a lunar cycle. More demanding in its own way than the full moon, because the full moon illuminates what is already built, whereas the first quarter asks you to choose what you are building in a moment when you can still clearly see the options. What you build in the direction of tonight's honest impulse will grow toward the full moon in May with the particular vigor of something that was started from a real place. What you avoid building tonight will be carried into the gibbous phase as the slightly heavier weight of a decision that was available and declined. The first quarter moon does not judge either response. The sky has no stake in whether you take the step or not. But the consequences of your choices belong to you in the way that all genuine choices belong to the people who make them. And the sky tonight is simply being unusually transparent about what the choices are. The hidden path through the Leo woods is visible tonight. The woman who finds it is experienced enough to recognize it and honest enough to take it even though it is not the obvious path. The question is only whether you trust what you see and whether you are willing to let what you trust become an action in the world. The first quarter moon is exact at 10:31 p.m. The decision it is pressing for does not require that exact moment. It has been building all day since the moon shifted from Cancer to Leo this afternoon and the Venus-Uranus conjunction reached the final degree of Taurus. The decision is available in any hour tonight in which you choose to be genuinely present to what the deeper part of you already knows. The sky is not going to be more clear than it is tonight about what is being asked, and what is being asked at its most essential level is not complicated. It is simply real. And the real, as every honest life eventually discovers, is the only thing that actually leads anywhere worth going. If this transmission found you on the right night, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. As Uranus crosses into Gemini in 2 days, the sky enters a genuinely new chapter, and the decisions made at this first quarter moon will be among the first things navigated in Uranus's new territory. Stay close for what comes next.